Thank you very much. I had spent 2 years researching and writing about the radical Christian right in this country. I had had a great professor at Harvard Divinity School, James Luther Adams, who had been in Germany in 1935 and 1936, working with the so-called confessing church, the anti-Nazi church, comprised of a few individuals who stood up to the Nazi regime, including Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Martin Niemöller, Karl Barth, Albert Schweitzer. And I was in seminary in the early 1980s. Adams, this was perhaps this year that he spent in Germany was one that colored his understanding of the world as well as his theological commitment to social justice. He actually left Germany because he was finally picked up by the Gestapo, who held him and suggested maybe now was the time for him to go back to America, which he did. He left on a night train with framed portraits of Adolf Hitler over the contents of a suitcase, which the ruse worked when the border guards lifted the suitcases and saw the portraits of the Fuhrer. And what he brought back were rolls of home movie film of the so-called German Christian church, which was pro-Nazi, and these few courageous figures who opposed them. I watched hours of the grainy black and white footage in his apartment in Cambridge as he narrated. Adams told us, and this was the early 1980s, that when we were his age, he was then 80 years old, we would all be fighting the Christian fascists. He saw in the rise of the Christian right, long before we did, disturbing parallels with the so-called German Christian church. That fusion of Christian iconography and Christian language with the iconography and language of American nationalism. Now, this was an apocalyptic warning that at the time seemed somewhat fanciful. I ended up leaving the country. When I graduated from seminary, I went to cover the war in El Salvador, where I was for 5 years. But 20 years later, when I came back to the United States, the Christian right, the radical Christian right, had moved from the fringes and margins of society into the corridors of power in the executive, legislative, and judicial branches of government. They had created powerful systems of indoctrination through Christian radio and television, as well as Christian schools, that hermetically sealed tens of millions of Americans in this frightening and authoritarian belief system. Adams explained that the engine that pushed people into this non-reality-based belief system was despair, personal and economic. And it is despair that I think many of the great writers on totalitarianism, Karl Popper, Fritz Stern in his book, The Politics of Cultural Despair, as well as Hannah Arendt, cite as that which makes the rise of a totalitarian movement possible in an open society. It was the Weimarization of the American working class. It was the outsourcing of jobs. It was the slashing of state and federal assistance. It was the destruction of managed capitalism that pushed people into the arms of the radical Christian right. I came back and realized that Adams' warning was incredibly prescient, and that the country was, I think, somewhat mistaken in believing that this was a religious movement. Adams saw it clearly, and I think correctly, as a mass movement. I think it's the most dangerous mass movement in American history, and I set out over a 2-year period to spend immense amounts of time with the Christian right, pro-life weekends in Pennsylvania, creationist seminars in Missouri, several trips to Orange County, the Rust Belt, places like Youngstown, Ohio, where the end of the world is no longer an abstraction to many of these people. I went to the Creation Museum in Peterborough, Kentucky, a $25 million structure where there are elaborate recreations of biblical scenes, including the Garden of Eden. Of course, since everything was created, including the dinosaurs, in 6 days, the dinosaurs are in the Garden of Eden with saddles on them. There's a waterfall with Adam and Eve positioned in such a way that we can't see her breasts. Through the tour, where the guide explains sort of the thorny question as to why T-Rex has such big teeth, and that's because T-Rex was used to open the coconuts. And we then move on to a scale replica of Noah's Ark, and then there's that nagging question of how Noah got the dinosaurs on the Ark, it's explained to us that he got the dinosaurs on the Ark by putting baby dinosaurs on the Ark. Now, in a room like this, it's funny. But when you're standing in that museum with a group of true believers, it's terrifying. And I think that it's important to remember that what totalitarian systems do is they remove people from the real world and thrust them into a world of magic, miracles, destiny, historical inevitability. Comes in many forms, both secular and religious. One of the things that broke my heart when I interviewed scores of the followers of this movement, was the profound stories of economic dislocation, severe economic and financial hardships, personal distress, broken homes, sexual abuse. You know, in the pro-life movement, where I spent a fair bit of time, probably 80 or 90% of all of the women that I interviewed in the pro-life movement had multiple abortions. And this movement, of course, talks about love, talks about family, but it is deeply cruel in its manipulation of this despair and guilt. For instance, one of the tactics in the pro-life movement is to bring what they call post-abortive women away for a weekend. This is run by a group, right-wing Catholic group called Priests for Life. And the women come and they give them dolls. And they tell them, these are the children you have murdered. And they must name these dolls and hold them and clothe them and sleep with them. And at the end of the weekend, they offer up their murdered children to God and beg for forgiveness and promise to dedicate their lives to fighting what is termed the culture of death, which is us. This movement talks about family, but of course it is the great destroyer of family. I don't know how many times I stood in mega churches or weekends with groups of believers, tears streaming down their face, choking back sobs, asking that everyone pray for an unsaved family member, for a spouse, a child, a parent. Because once you are sucked into these mega churches, which are all about cults of personality, all of your recreation time, your educational time, your spiritual time is absorbed. And you are cut off from family members who do not submit to the authority of these religious figures, who are, of course, male. The patriarchal system is strongly pounded into this movement, as it is into all fascist and totalitarian movements. When they talk about the dominant male within the family and the subservient woman and the obedient children, they are talking about a power model that is replicated within these megachurches and is to be implanted into the society at whole.